We're now going to move on to our discussion of the High Renaissance. And when you think about why something is called high, it usually is because it means it's great. And so in the case of the High Renaissance, many Renaissance scholars feel that this is the best example, right, of Renaissance work. You know, it's all in the eye of the beholder, but this is the time of Leonardo and Michelangelo, Raphael, right? So that is why the high title, I believe, gets attached to this Renaissance, and many believe it's the high point, right, of creation as far as Renaissance artworks. Now, we talked about Florence, right, or what we call early Renaissance, and now we're moving south to primarily talk about works that are conceived of in Rome. This doesn't mean that all high Renaissance work, of course, is made in Rome, but I find that that is the typical situation, right? And we see that the Pope or the Church has a huge hand in what is created at this time as far as patronage is concerned. And so Rome will figure quite prominently, right, in the high Renaissance equation of who's getting money, who's getting commissions, right? And again, the church is going to be very, very important to the artists of this time. Which leads us to discussing a bit about the Counter-Reformation. So I know there's a lot on this slide, but I think it's very important to consider what is happening at the church what is happening in the church or to the church at this time. Now, we're not going to discuss it in depth, and it happens outside this class, a bit before the time period of this class starts, but it's important to understand the Protestant Reformation in contrast or comparison to the Counter-Reformation. If you don't know about the Protestant Reformation, it's when the Catholic Church split into two, basically, because the Christian Church, of course, its root is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is from where all branches of Christianity come from. It's the root, right, from which the Christian tree grows. And Protestantism was the first branch, as we say, off of the Catholic tree. And this came about because Martin Luther believed very strongly that the Catholic Church was on the wrong track, that they were doing things that were improper. For instance, there was a huge concern with what they called the indulgences that Catholics were allowing people to buy in order to be forgiven of their sins. So you'll notice in the other column, right, indulgences offered. Protestantism said, you know, you shouldn't have the ability to buy off your sins. Your faith should be very simple. It should be very personal. There shouldn't be a lot of pageantry to it. And again, Protestants really felt the Catholics fell prey to these notions. And so the Protestant Reformation comes from that. Lutheranism, of course, is from Martin Luther. And Protestantism is the type of religion, right, that we see with things like Lutheranism, Methodism, those kind of strains of Christianity. So why introduce you to Protestantism, the Protestant Reformation, is because the Counter-Reformation will actually impact the kind of art you see created for our purposes. Because a lot of high Renaissance art is actually what we term Counter-Reformation art. Because it's made in a Catholic context. It's commissioned typically by the Pope. We're in Rome after all. And its function is to counter, in a sense, what Protestantism was putting forward. The Counter-Reformation said, well, you know, of course you need to be excessive sometimes. So of course you need to create beautiful things using gold and gems and, you know, all kinds of luxurious materials, because how else will you create stunning artworks that can then instruct people? So from the Catholic point of view, they said, you need to spend a lot of money on beautiful art because it's necessary to instruct people, to inspire them. And, you know, it's necessary to have the church. It's necessary to have them there as an intermediary between you and God. You need to have these things. So a lot of the artwork we're going to see, it's made under the Counter-Reformation banner of this art is necessary. This art is part of being Catholic. It's part of dazzling the minds of, you know, those who follow our church. And that Protestants, you might want to be more simplistic, but that's not what Catholics believe. Later, when we go to look at Northern Renaissance works, we're going to be looking more at Protestant artworks. So keep this slide in mind. When we go look at like very simple works in Germany or in the Netherlands, they're made under the Protestant methodology. So they're going to be simple. They're going to be pared down. They're not going to be glitzy and glamorous. They're not going to use a lot of luxurious materials. So hopefully by the end of our discussion of the Renaissance, you can compare and contrast artwork made under a Protestant mentality and artwork made under a Counter-Reformation mentality. You'll be able to see the difference. So that's my hope, right, as we go along and look at both the High Renaissance and then the Northern Renaissance in our next module. Another important thing I always like to bring up about the High Renaissance is that this is when artists as individuals, that concept is really born. And I always refer to it as the genius myth. Because before this, if you look at the role of artists throughout art history, really there's no point in time in art history except for the Greeks. So if you're in Art History 1, you might say, wait, hold up, there was the Greeks. Yes, there was. But there was really no other part of art history besides the Greeks where artists were named and very much celebrated. Typically, what you saw artists doing is working collectively in workshops, anonymously. So if you go back and look at Egyptian artwork, again, you're not going to run into named artists because that's not the way they worked. If you look at medieval artwork, there's not named artists for the most part. That's not how they worked. So we see a shift in that happens in the Renaissance that continues for the rest of art history. So I always say, lucky you guys, lucky my Art History 2 students, who are going to have to learn a lot of artists' names. Because the people who take Art History 1, they're like, yay, hardly any artist names. And you're like, oh, crap. So many artists. Well, again, you can thank the Renaissance. And the man that you can also thank for sort of propping up this attitude of like a named artist should be celebrated, should be written down for the ages, right? Like Michelangelo that you're seeing here. This is the close-up of the David. It's basically, we can link it to Vasari, who wrote a book called Lives of the Artists. Vasari was also an artist as well, a practicing artist, but he's really not known for that. He's known for writing this book. And I joke that when you become an art historian, when you show up at your graduate program, they basically hand you this book and say, welcome, future art historian, here's your Vasari. Because it's something that every art historian is expected to read, because Vasari is considered really the first art historian. And he created a methodology we still refer to as biographical. When you learn to be an art historian, you learn that what we call the methods of art history. And the first method that was ever created was biography, or biographical method. Basically, it is telling the stories of the artists. Because if you think about it, back in the Renaissance, there's no photography. There's really no way to actually look at artworks unless you're seeing them in person to discuss them. So what Vasari was doing as an art historian is he would explain like the life of Michelangelo and why he was a genius, or the life of Leonardo and why he's a genius. So again, we always say he's the first art historian. He really, speaks to this idea of these artists are important. We need to know their backgrounds. We need to know who they are in order to understand their works. And from there, other methods of art history have been born. So you might hear about like Marxism or semiotics, right? Formalism, but biographical is the first, and Vasari is the person we credit that with. If you took Art History 1, you might also remember Vasari was the one who named the Gothic, because he said the artwork was so terrible, it looks like a bunch of Goths made it. So you might remember Vasari from that if you've taken previously Art History 1. So thanks, Vasari, right, for the artist myth, right? And that will govern, our discussions together in the class. In the next video, right, we're going to get into those great artists. And we're going to start out with Leonardo, who I really consider kind of the old man, right, of the High Renaissance. And we'll talk a little bit about his work.